in a different location. So by the way, I'm Daniel Warchulski, and my partner in crime today is?
I'm Aaron Ward. I'm originally from New Zealand, but I live and work in Tokyo in Japan. And Dan is from the other end of the world too. So.
Yeah, so I'm actually Polish Canadian. I have lived in Poland. I lived in Canada for many years, and now I'm in Japan. And actually, Aaron and I are quite far apart. I'm down in Kobe, Osaka area, which is about 500 or 600 kilometers away from each other. So yeah, I guess we'll begin. Welcome to our presentation. Today we'll be talking about the effects of time spent abroad on Japanese EFL student engagement with language outside the classroom. And before we begin, we'd just like to say pozdrowienia z Japonii. I don't know if everyone's Polish, but yeah, just greetings from Japan. If anybody has questions during our presentation, please feel free to interrupt. I believe there is somebody from IATEFL Poland that's going to allow you to speak if you so wish. So does anybody have any questions before we begin? Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so we'll begin with a little bit of background and just to sort of set the stage for what we'll be talking about today. And we'd just like to begin with talking a little bit about cultural competence. And basically, the way that we see this is we see all speakers of a particular language coming from a particular community that does basically, it makes up a cultural context. And the idea of cultural competence, this is something that's been written about by quite a few experts in the field. And basically, I think many of us would agree that it is very important to have knowledge about a particular culture in order to be able to master the language appropriately. To achieve a native-like competency, cultural competence is quite important. Now, one of the goals that we as educators try to strive for within the classroom is we try to make our classrooms and the environments within our classrooms to approximate that which takes place outside of the classroom. And within the classroom, we also try to promote things like culture besides teaching language skills. Now, cultural knowledge, it's often referred to as a tacit resource, and we like to think about it this way as well. There's a certain instrumental value to cultural engagement within a particular community. It helps put the language in a particular and, more importantly, appropriate context. And it basically provides speakers of that language with a very good understanding of how things are actually done. And we would arguably say that this comes through experience mainly outside the classroom within a particular community. So what about the classroom? What are we actually trying to teach there? Well, we're basically teaching specific grammar rules, vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera. We do try to teach various aspects of culture. And we try to teach our students how to exploit, bend, and break various rules within a language.
So over to me. Just to give an example of the kinds of problems students might have is that we quite often teach things in the classroom as being a kind of nomothetic rule. So if we're teaching a grammar point like the present perfect, the past participle and have, to talk about experience or something which has changed from the past to now. But actually, when people go out into the real world, if you will, people don't actually tend to use language that way. And quite often they bend or break the rules, as Dan said before. And this can be quite tricky for students to understand. So, for example, on the screen at the moment, there's a It's not actually a quote from a Batman movie, it's something I made up, but it's an illustration of the kinds of problems students might have if they try to use language as it's learned in the classroom outside the classroom, out on the street or something. And this is an example of Cockney English, which is English from the East End of London area in Britain. So I'm not sure how many people have seen Batman before, but the two characters on the left, the guy on the left is Christian Bale, who plays Batman, and the guy on the right is Michael Caine, who's a Cockney British actor, and he's playing his butler in this particular series of movies. Now, the guy that's playing the butler, Michael Caine, he tends to sort of make fun a little bit of his lord or master, which is Batman in this particular case, and he does it by using a lot of Cockney English. So there's a sort of a quote on the right-hand side which says, "All I was saying is if I were you, Master Wayne, I'd be a bit more careful on the old apples and pears." Now, if you were to just present this to the students, you might find that they have a number of problems understanding what's going on here for various reasons. Number one, because there are what seem to be some very obvious grammatical mistakes. And number two, there's sort of inside language games going on here as well, which help to establish the relationship and the power relationship between the two speakers. So the first thing you'll notice is it says, "all I was saying." The correct subject-verb agreement here would be is all I was saying was, blah, blah, blah. And then if I was you, you've got another reversal here where they're using the wrong subject-verb agreement. It should be were, because it's a hypothetical situation. But this is quite commonly how Cockney speakers of English will speak. They will invert the correct verb form here for subjunctives and also for participle forms as well. The next bit, Master Wayne, is quite interesting. Can people in the audience hear or answer things at all? Does anybody know what master means here? Or and the crowd goes silent. Okay, so England has a traditional social hierarchical system, and master is an honorific used for a young boy who's of a higher class or higher status than older person from a lower class status. But the important thing is here is master is used only for boys, so up to the age of about 13. After that, you'd call them sir. So in this particular case, he's calling him Master Wayne, which is inappropriate because Batman, in this case, is actually an adult. And so when he says Master Wayne, he's talking to them as though he were actually a little boy. Then he's giving him some advice, which is again a little bit out of the cultural context, which it would normally be. A senior status person wouldn't take advice from a lower status person. So he's saying, I'd be a bit more careful on the old apples and pears. Now, old is interesting here too. I'll explain that in a minute, but first of all, apples and pears. Does anybody have any ideas as to what that might be? Dan, have you got any ideas, mate?
Go ahead, Aaron, by all means.
Okay, so this is Cockney rhyming slang, and what it does is basically the first word and the second word are a pair. They work together, if you excuse the pun. So apples and pears are both fruit, but it's the first word that's the key word, and apples, the second word is the key word because it's a homonym. It sounds like another word, and the other word in this case is stairs. So what he's saying is I'd be a bit more careful on the stairs. Now you can see Batman is looking a bit sick and he's walking on a cane, so it looks like he's had an accident or something. Now the word old here is also important as well because it's also a term of endearment, talking about the old stairs which Master Wayne should be familiar with. So by referring to them in this way, he's actually telling Master Wayne that he's been a bit of an idiot in this particular case because he should be familiar with the stairs and shouldn't be falling down them and hurting himself. So you can see in this very short piece of language, there are quite a lot of things which would be very difficult to A, teach in the classroom, and B, very difficult for students to understand if they encountered them without some sort of cultural understanding from outside the classroom. Does anyone have any questions about that? Nope, I guess we can move on then, Master Dan.
Okay, there we are.
Okay, so the next thing is the travel rule. This is something I picked up a few years ago from a writer called Jenkins, who actually wrote a book about a quite well-known post-structuralist French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu. And what he argues is that putting language and cultural acquisition into meaningful use should be viewed a little bit like a sports game. So, for example, in the classroom, we teach students grammar rules or vocabulary rules and things like that. But actually using them in a game or outside in the real world is actually considerably different to what we might teach them in the classroom. So the example I'm going to give here is the basketball travel rule. Now, if you're familiar with basketball, the rule is basically this. Once you've finished dribbling the ball, bouncing the ball, you can pick it up and you can take 2 steps before you either have to shoot it or pass it. If you take 3 or more steps, then the ball gets automatically passed over to the other team. You've broken the rules. So the rule's quite simple. Pick up the ball, 2 steps, shoot or pass. That's the rule. Reasonably easy to understand for most people, but it's actually quite difficult to understand and invigilate this during a game because there are 10 people on the court, plus there's usually 2 or 3 referees and a whole raft of other people who may be distracting you, people in the crowd and so on. So it's very difficult to keep account of how many steps that people are actually taking. So it's quite difficult to follow this rule if you're actually playing a game of basketball. So you can see there's a video on the bottom right-hand corner. The frame rate's dropped off a bit, unfortunately, but if you watch through it, you'll see that a guy comes through with the ball and 2 guys bang into each other, and then a 3rd guy bangs into him, and at least 2 of them end up on the floor. Now, basketball is a non-contact sport, so anybody who bangs into another player has automatically broken the rules. The question is, who's broken the rules in this particular situation? Anybody got any ideas? Or no? It's a very quiet crowd today. Okay, so actually it's the guy who scores, who gets through all the crowd and scores through the hoop with the layup, is the one who's broken the rules. And the reason is he's actually taken 3 steps. Now that's broken the travel rule, and that's what's caused the breakdown on the game here. Now, the point about all of this is that it's not easy to see how it is that this guy's broken the rules. So we'll now go on to explain a little bit about why it is that learning things in context is very important in order to be able to use and understand the rules carefully. So Dan, if you could flip to the next slide. No, that's too many, I think. We're missing one. There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so the point here is that experts of anything, whether it's language or game, they tend to rely on tacit knowledge rather than declarative knowledge. So they're not sitting there counting how many steps the players have taken. That doesn't happen. What they do is they understand on their knowledge of how the game should play out in situation. So following or breaking the rules isn't strictly speaking important, but only whether or not doing so interrupts the flow of the game. So if you think back about Michael Caine talking to Christian Bale before, Michael Caine's breaking a lot of language rules there, but it doesn't interrupt the understanding of what's going on. It doesn't interrupt the conversation. And the reason being is because within that particular context, the rules are actually working okay. So you've got 2 more examples of the travel rule in basketball at the bottom. On the bottom left-hand side is, I'm not sure again what the frame rate is like for viewers, but you've got LeBron James running through and doing a dunk. Now there are 4 defenders there. Normally this should be easy to stop him getting through, but he's got a clear break and he's a very big guy. He weighs about 110, 120 kilograms, I think. He's also the best basketball player in the game at the moment. So you'd have to be pretty silly to get in front of this guy because you're going to get hit. And you're also going to get embarrassed on national TV as well. But he actually breaks the rules again by taking too many steps. Basically, he just mistimes what he's doing here. But none of the other players notice this, and the ref doesn't notice it either. And the reason is because they just expect him to score in this particular situation. So the rules have been broken, but it hasn't interrupted the game flow at all. On the right-hand side, you've got a different situation. On the right-hand side is another very well-known player called Russell Westbrook. Now, again, you can't take more than 2 steps if you don't shoot or pass the ball. And he walks in from the back of the court because the other team has just scored, and he takes about 4 or 5 steps holding the ball. And then the ref blows the whistle. Now, this is quite embarrassing if you think about it. He's one of the best basketball players in the world. He walks in from the back of the court, the ball. He's obviously blatantly broken the rules here, and everybody can see it. It's immediately obvious. The question is, why would a professional basketball player who gets paid literally hundreds of millions of dollars to play break the rules? And the reason it's to do with context. In other contexts, this particular kind of play is okay. So if you play 3-on-3 or street basketball, there's no referee. And when you bring the ball in from the back, the person doesn't have to pass it. They can walk it in. It doesn't start until they start dribbling the ball. So in a different context, doing this exact kind of thing isn't against the rules in basketball. So again, the same idea applies. When students learn language, they also have to learn and understand that the rules apply in some cases, they don't apply in others. They apply very strictly in a test, for example, but out on the street, people are either going to break them quite frequently, or it will be part of the outside rules to break them, or people are going to break them, but it doesn't really matter because the game continues to flow, the conversation, the understanding continues to go, and there aren't any breakdowns in communication. Any questions so far? No? Okay, Dan, were you going to have a look at this one, or is this me?
No, go ahead, Aaron. I'll take the next one.
Okay, so what we're really talking about here is shifting from a rational understanding of language to an aestheticized understanding. Now, aestheticized here isn't to do with beauty, it's just to do with non-rational. So rational means you make very clear decisions based on information, or you do things according to the rules. Aestheticized version instead is that you do things according to what feels right in a particular situation. And this is an idea which comes again from Bourdieu, who I mentioned earlier on. And he's suggesting that cultural knowledge that's acquired through community engagement provides what's known as a feel for the game. So same thing with the basketball analogy I gave before. The people playing the game don't think about the rules. They never think about the rules. All they're doing is thinking about whether or not it all flows together properly. And they know the rules have been broken if something unusual happens. If the timing's out, something doesn't go right, then the rules have been broken. And this is what the feel for a game is. So students who are able to communicate effectively have a good feeling for the game. They can go out, they can talk in situations, they can do things without having to think about what it is that they're doing. And what this does is it gives them a kind of tacit resource for organizing, comprehending, and acting within what would otherwise be an incomprehensible flow of sociolinguistic information. There are so many things going on, it's impossible to keep a track of them. Instead, what you have to do is understand whether or not all the parts are flowing together properly at the right time. And what this means is that second language, I'm going to go back, Dan, sorry, you jumped.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
Sure. It allows the students to understand language learning as part of a whole, rather than as a set of discrete rules that they have to just deploy when they're out talking to people or communicating with people. Okay.
All right. So let me just quickly talk about this. So basically what Aaron's just talked about is sort of a need to acquire a certain level of cultural competence. And this often comes through engagement within a particular community outside the classroom. So in our case, some of the potential sources of this include cram school, which is a particular type of school in Japan that students attend basically a few days a week after they go to their regular school to help them pass entrance exams and things of that nature. Another source is perhaps studying and living abroad. And then there's entertainment, including music, movies, social media, etc. Can anybody think of any other potential sources of cultural and community engagement that students might have?
I understand there's a group chat in this presentation, but we can't see what the chat is. So if anybody's typing something in, it's okay if you're not, but if you are,
yeah.
we can see that. So
and I think there's also a way to maybe do something with the participants, but I'm not particularly good at using Zoom. I tend to use Google Meet more often, so it's a little bit difficult with the controls. So our apologies there.
Okay, if you have some questions, the simple thing might be to turn on the microphone if you'd like to, but if you've not, that's absolutely fine as well.
Yeah, I think participants can perhaps turn on their microphone, I hope.
Okay, all right, then we'll move to the next one, shall we then?
So moving on, let's look at cram school. And Aaron, I'm going to defer this to you because I think you're going to be able to explain this much better in a technical way. So there is definitely.
So, last year I published a paper looking at students speaking. Now, the reason for doing this is the standard test which is used for proficiency in Japan is called TOEIC, which is a test of English for international communication. Now, a couple of things about this test. Number one, it's distributed mass on mass. Almost every student in Japan will take this test. They literally do millions of these tests every year. Sometimes students will take it 2 or 3 times as well for various reasons. And because the test is done en masse, it's all multiple choice questions. So it's not testing any productive skills at all. All it does is test listening and reading comprehension, and it's always 4 multiple choice questions. So there's always a possibility that even if the student doesn't understand the question or understand the text or whatever, excuse me, that they can still get a point for guessing the correct answer or having a good guess at the correct answer. And in fact, there are a lot of textbooks and courses out there which teach students how to answer the question even if they don't know what the answer is. So it's quite an interesting thing. But in any case, this is the most common form of English assessment in Japan. And the 2 sections are listening and reading. And the total score which you can get for those 2 portions of the test is up to 990. So 445 for listening, 445 for reading. There are actually new speaking and writing elements to the test too, but these are not used very much. I think only about 6% of total test takers actually do the speaking and the writing components. It's all delivered online as well, so there's no face-to-face interactions, no contextual cues and things like that. So a few years ago, I was interested in whether or not the listening and the reading scores were in some way or other predictive of actual in-class speaking skills, so that you could decide whether or not TOEIC scores were useful for sorting students into speaking classes. Anyway, so if you're more interested in finding out what I did exactly, the paper at the bottom is Award 2020, Do You Speak TOEIC? It is actually online, I think, but I can send it to people if you'd like to read it as well. In any case, what I did is I compared the students' TOEIC scores across a raft of different measures. And what I did in this particular case is looked at whether or not students attended cram school, because it's one obvious source outside of regular schooling that might help them with their English. Now, if you have a look at the table to the middle on the left, you'll see there are a set of t-tests. Thanks, Dan. And on the right, it says in brackets NS all the way down. And what this means is it's not significant. Now, that basically means that whether or not you go to cram school doesn't seem to help your listening score in TOEIC. It doesn't help your reading score in TOEIC, or any of the other measures which I took of in class speaking, which are fluency, how fluent the speakers were, how accurate they were, how confident they were at speaking, how willing they were to speak. And the last bit is attention, whether or not they stuck to the task in speaking as well. In fact, all of these things are slightly negative, except for attention, which is slightly positive. So students who do go to cram school tend to stick to the task better, but otherwise they seem to do worse on all of these other measures. Again, none of it's significant, so it doesn't actually matter terribly much, but you can see that the sample size was quite large. It was between 480 and 482 and 351 students that participated in this study. So quite big, reasonably large sample size, so good statistical power, and the effect size would be there if there was as well. Okay, does anyone have any questions about that? Now, this might seem all a little bit complicated for the time being if you're not familiar with statistics, but just bear in mind that cram school doesn't actually seem to help students when it comes to improving their English. Okay, Dan, shall we move to the next one?
Yeah, let's move on. So let me take over for a little bit here. You've been very helpful. Okay, so let's maybe look at the cram school problem in just a little more detail. And so based on what Aaron just said, it would seem that it doesn't really make sense for students to go to cram school, and it's not necessarily helpful or so helpful in their language skills, or so it would seem. So we need to ask ourselves the questions: why are students actually choosing to go to cram school, or not choosing to go to cram school to study English? Well, there's several reasons why students do that. One, cost. Cram school is quite expensive, and I can attest to that.
I have no idea.
It's quite expensive. My son's actually in cram school, and it's about $500 a month for twice a week, and that's not even one of the more expensive ones.
Now, like 2,000 zloty or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah, so for some students, maybe there's a need, perhaps there's a need, and there's also alternatives that we need to look at, such as studying and living abroad. Okay, let's move on. Let's get into our actual research questions. So based on some of the information that we've just given you, we came up with four what we thought were important and relevant research questions. So first we wanted to know, why does cram school appear not to help students with their language skills? Um, Secondly, we also wanted to know how student attitudes are mediated by previous community engagement. And this was indexed by the time that students spent abroad. So we looked at that. We also decided to look at students' attitudes towards community engagement in English. And for that, we looked at four particular areas. We looked at speaking, we looked at listening to music, watching movies and television in English, and of course, reading English books and magazines and so on. And then finally, we thought it'd be very interesting to look at the implications for students' future aspirations. Are there any implications? And if so, what are they? So,
A question came up in the chat, which
yeah.
I can see now, sorry.
You can see that. Okay, I can't see it.
What about reading text? This is, I'm not sure if you meant for us or for the students, but reading is something we're going to talk about shortly. So thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just move on quickly because I don't want to run out of time. We're already going about 30 minutes here. So the sample that we have is actually quite large. We have over 1,000 participants from a number of different universities across Japan. We administered all the questionnaires to the students in Japanese to ensure that their responses would be accurate and that they were able to understand what they were being asked. And most of the students were first year, although we did have some students that were perhaps second or third year, but mostly first year students. And there were more males than females, although it is close to being 50-50. And basically with the cram school problem, well, TOEIC, we believe, is not an ideal measure, but it is reasonably well understood, and it's universally used in a lot of Asian countries anyways. Aaron, maybe you could just mention something about your study here.
Okay, so the results we looked at before indicate that going to cram school, which, as Dad mentioned, actually costs quite a lot of money, about $500 a month. Why bother spending that money if it doesn't actually have any effect? Now, of course, cram school wasn't just English. There are other things attached to it too, but we only asked the students about whether or not they studied English at cram school. So the question would be, why would people bother to spend this money if it doesn't actually have any effect? So the question is it really true? Does it actually not have an effect? And that's what we're going to have a look at now. So, can I flick over, Dan, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, sorry, Aaron, can I get you to explain these? I think you could be able to much better explain the statistics than I can.
Okay, so the first thing we looked at here was we split the students up into three groups. I call it, this is all self-reported, bear in mind. Those students who said they've never been abroad for any reason, those have been abroad for 1 to 3 months, and this could be studying abroad or living abroad, and 6 months or more. So those are the three basic groups that we used here. In this particular case, we also asked the students and compared it with whether or not they attended cram school to study English. That was the key thing here. So what you can see is that the students, most of the students, or sorry, more of the students have studied cram school than not. You can see 63% versus 36% at the bottom. But the longer that they've spent abroad, the less likely they report to have studied English. So those who've never been abroad, 66% of them have. Those who spent 1 to 3 months, 62%, but less than 50% had spent 6 months abroad. So what you can see is that the number of students who went to cram school drops as a function of more time they've spent abroad. And you can see there's a chi-squared analysis at the top, which shows that this is a significant result. So these numbers are statistically not independent of one another, i.e. it's not a random pattern of results. There is a pattern here which is statistically significant. So just to quantify what the actual impact of that might be, we did the same thing by comparing the amount of time the students have spent abroad and their TOEIC scores. And there's an ANOVA was conducted, which you can see on the right-hand side, sorry, Dan. It says F2 707, 164.72p less than 0.000 and so on, which is quite a strong result. And the two key post hoc tests indicate why that is. You can see the three subsets. So if you have a look at where it says 1, underneath 1 is the average score, TOEIC score for students who've never been abroad at 427. 2 is 504. This is for students who spent 1 to 3 months abroad. So they're significantly higher TOEIC scores than those who've never been abroad. And then 6 months or more is 743. So there's quite a large jump there, almost twice the score of those students who've never been abroad. So we can see that actually studying abroad does have some sort of effect on students' English proficiency as measured by the TOEIC test. We're going to try and unpack a little bit more as to why that might be as well now too. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Oh, okay, so to try and get a better understanding of this, we're then going to have a look at those three groups of students, those who've never been abroad, those who've spent 1 to 3 months abroad or 6 months or more, and compare whether or not having gone to cram school has any effect on their TOEIC scores. And what you can see is the never group, those students who've never been abroad, there's a t-test there, the score is 2.12 and probability of less than 0.03. So if you've never been abroad, going to cram school does seem to help your TOEIC score and by extension, hopefully your English. So going to cram school is useful for students who've never been abroad. However, if you look at the other two groups, 1 to 3 months and 6 or more months, you can see that there's a slightly negative result, but it's not significant. So the reason why TOEIC didn't seem to have, cram school didn't seem to have a benefit to speaking or to TOEIC scores a few screens back is because if you haven't been abroad, it is useful. If you have been abroad, it's probably not so likely to have been useful. All right, the next bit is to then have a look at where students studied at high school. So we split them up into just two groups this time. Obviously, there's no point in asking the never students because they could only have gone to high school in Japan. And then we looked at the students who've been 1 to 3 months abroad and 6 months or more abroad, bearing in mind that almost all of the students in the study were first-year students. So their study abroad experience had to have been in at least their high school years. And what you can see is that those who spent a relatively short amount of time abroad, almost all of them studied at high school in Japan, 92.7% against 7.3. But there's a bit of a change if they've been away for 6 months or more. And you suddenly get a decrease in the number of students who studied high school in Japan and somewhat of an increase in those who studied abroad. Now, this is a little bit fuzzy because we couldn't get enough detailed data as to how much time they'd spent abroad because the number of students who had spent longer amounts of time abroad is significantly smaller than the rest of the students. In any case, there's a chi-squared analysis being done on this again, and you can see the significant results. So that this result isn't random either. Okay, so we move on. All right, the last one is just to look at the other two factors together, which is to say whether or not they went to high school in Japan or whether they went to high school abroad and whether or not they went to cram school. So what we're trying to do here is to tease out what kind of students are actually going to cram school. And so for the students who went to cram school, you can see about 50-50 of them went to studied in Japan. So if you went to cram school, about half of them studied at high school in Japan and half didn't go to cram school. Whereas those who went abroad to study at high school, a lot more of them didn't go to cram school. So again, what you're essentially seeing here from those TOEIC tests earlier is that the students who, on the balance of things, had better scores anyway, didn't go to cram school. So again, this is why it seems as though cram school doesn't actually have an effect. The other point is that there's another chi-squared analysis at the top there, chi-squared of 1.23, but it's not significant. Part of the reason for this is that the number of students who studied abroad or lived abroad and went to high school abroad was actually very, very small. Nonetheless, we compared these two groups' average TOEIC score, and you can see that those who studied at high school abroad and went abroad, the average score was 822 out of 990. Those who went to high school in Japan, the average score was 718.83. And this is significantly different again. So going abroad and attending high school abroad did have a significant effect on the TOEIC scores as a measure of proficiency of English. Now that score isn't particularly large, but again, you have to bear in mind that the number of students in that group is very small, so the statistical power of this test is relatively small as well. If we could bolster the group, I imagine that score would become quite a lot more, a higher significant difference. Any questions? Maybe they're sleeping. Okay, next screen.
All right, so let me take over for a little bit here. So what are the implications of what we've said so far? Well, basically, spending time abroad, it influences a number of things. Not only does it influence the performance on standardized tests of English proficiency, such as the TOEIC, it may also influence student attitudes towards engaging with the English language community. So we wanted to find out a little bit more about this, and is it the case that it may actually also influence students' attitudes? The other thing which we'll look at lastly, we also wanted to know a little bit more about students' prior experience with language communities and how this affects their aspirations for the future, which we mentioned a few moments ago. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this. So we asked students in terms of engagement, we asked them about their speaking, and we asked them which statement best describes their speaking in English with others. And basically we gave the students a questionnaire with five items in it, and we tried to correspond each item to a particular part here on this pie chart that you can see. So students that only talk to other people when they absolutely had to, we grouped those students and called them avoidant. Moving on, we have indifferent. So these are students that are a little less avoidant, but they're still indifferent. Then we have students that are ambivalent. And then we get into the more positive aspect. So we have students, we group them as positive and also as proactive. So when it comes to speaking, we can see that students who have never been abroad, they tend to be very avoidant when it comes to speaking in English with others. Now, once we move along and we look at students that have been abroad for a little bit of time, 1 to 3 months, we can see that they are starting to become a little less avoidant. And quite interestingly, when we look at the group of students that spent 6 months or more abroad, we see that things become quite even. Students tend to become much less avoidant, and in particular, they become more positive and proactive, as we can see here. So we can see that speaking in English to others seems to be affected by students' time spent abroad. Now, if we move along and we look at engagement with music in English, we again ask students very similar questions just to maintain some consistency in our scales. And again, we can see that students who have never been abroad tend to be quite avoidant when it comes to listening to music. Students that have been abroad for 1 to 3 months, maybe a little less avoidant. But when we look at students who have been abroad for 6 or more months, we can see that the number of avoidant students seems to decrease quite a bit. Now, what's interesting here is that there is quite a large group of students here that are indifferent. Now, there's a number of possibilities for this. We thought that maybe one of the reasons for it might be that music is one of those things that it's difficult to escape. Basically, many places that we go, we tend to hear music, whether it's at a shopping mall or at a bar, somewhere in the background, and so on. Now, another thing that we found quite interesting is we asked students some very specific questions about which kinds of music they listen to. And most of the students' responses tended to be quite similar, and they tend to listen to sort of a pop type music, such as with artists such as Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, and so on. And many of the responses were quite similar.
Just one other, if I could add there, sorry, Dan.
Yeah.
The other thing you learn about music is you don't have to understand it to enjoy it. So
absolutely.
you can see that there's quite a lot of students who report being avoidant or indifferent. It doesn't really matter that you understand it in order to get some enjoyment out of music. It's another issue too, which is different to the other skills we looked at, which is also why the item on the scale for this one has been changed slightly from the other three. Okay, sorry, Dan.
Yep. Any questions so far about listening to music or speaking to others? Okay, so moving on, let's take a look at how watching movies or TV in English, how is that affected by students' time spent abroad? So again, we see over here, students that have never been abroad. For this particular category, we see that the avoidant area is a little bit smaller. There are less avoidant students, and we see that there are quite a few indifferent students. Now, if we move along and we look at students that were abroad for 1 to 3 months, things don't seem to change too much. However, for students that have been abroad for 6 or more months, things seem to even out a little bit more, and in particular, students' attitudes and engagement with this area, they tend to be more positive and even proactive. Now, again, we asked students very specifically what types of movies and what kinds of television programs they're watching and interested in, and maybe it's surprising, maybe not. Most students tended to choose things such as Disney, Harry Potter, and something that's really interesting, I don't know if people in Europe are aware of this, but in Japan particularly, Disney is very, very popular, and there is a Disneyland in Tokyo here. And there's actually two, yes. So Tokyo Disneyland and Tokyo Sea is the other. I don't visit them too often, but I do know for a fact that these the Disneylands in Japan actually make more money than any other Disneyland in the world. So
all of the Disneylands in the world together.
All of the Disneylands, yes. So yeah, students love Disney. I was actually very shocked by this when I first came here.
Sorry, just one thing if I could add as well, Dan. You might notice that the largest section of the chart for all three groups is the indifferent one. The reason for that, again, we didn't ask them this, but when movies come out in Japan and then they're in English or some other language, they always have subtitles. So again, watching movies isn't actually dependent on whether or not they understand the English or whatever language it's in, because there are subtitles in Japanese as well. Okay, thanks, Dan.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, and lastly, we looked at reading. And again, we asked students very similar questions, and we can see a fairly similar pattern here. So students that have never been abroad tend to be avoidant when it comes to reading things in English. Those that have spent some time abroad, 1 to 3 months, we can see that things are a little more even, but we still see quite a few students that are avoidant. However, once we look at the students who have spent 6 or more months abroad, we see that things again even out. There's less students that are avoidant of reading things in English. And in particular, we see that quite a few of the students have become or tend to be more proactive and positive when it comes to reading things in English. And again, we ask students specifically what they like to read in English, and maybe this is a surprise, maybe not. Wasn't for me this time, actually. Most of the students are reading Harry Potter.
Or similar kind.
In Japan as well. Disney, there were some Disney things in there also, but I think Harry Potter was the most popular, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Aaron?
Yeah, certainly it was something that came up quite frequently, probably in no small part because there are movies available, so the students can read and watch the movies and get a better understanding that way as well.
Exactly. Okay, so let's move on. Whoops, it's a little bit too far. Oh my gosh, sorry. Okay, there we are. So what are some general observations based on what we've said so far? Well, we can basically say this. It appears that the longer that students spend abroad, the less avoidant they are of the English language community and their engagement with the English language in various respects. And in particular, those who have spent 6 or more months abroad, those students tend to be more positive and proactive about engaging with the English language community and with English in general. All right, let's move on here quickly. Aaron, can I maybe ask you to talk about this a little bit?
So the next thing that we ask the students is to see whether or not their previous experience and their had any effect on whether they were likely to report wanting to spend more time abroad in the future. So we asked them if they'd like to live or work in another country after they graduate. So again, we've got a scale which goes up, not at all, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 1 to 3 years, yes for more than 3 years. And the last one, which is a little bit different, is I prefer not to work or live in Japan, i.e. they would like to emigrate. And again, looking at those 3 groups of how much time they've already spent abroad, never, 1 to 3 months or 6 months. And you'll see there's an interesting pattern here. It's actually quite noticeable that the students all report wanting to spend some time abroad. So particularly for those who've never been abroad or spent 1 to 3 months abroad, quite a lot of them said either they would not like to go at all or they would like to go for 3 to 6 months. And then you can see a decrease in those particular 2 groups as you go further down. However, the 6-month group is quite different once again. You can see that the lowest number of them would report that they wouldn't want to go abroad at all. So they definitely want to go somewhere at some point. And you can see a slight increase to 3 to 6 months and a drop off at 6 to 12 months. But from there, there's increases again. Who would like to spend 1 to 3 years living abroad, 3 or more years abroad, and or immigrate. And you can see in these last 2 categories, 3 years or more or emigrate, there's quite a lot more of the students who've already been abroad who would report that they would like to spend these longer periods abroad. And again, we did a chi-squared test on this, and it shows that there's a significant result here, so that these results are not independent of one another, i.e. there is a predictable pattern to it. But it's quite interesting, actually, particularly for the 6-month group, that basically half of them said they want to spend 3 years or more or emigrate from Japan afterwards, which kind of makes you wonder a little bit whether or not they started to feel alienated from their own Japanese culture because of the time that they've already spent abroad. Okay, next screen, please. Okay, and the last one we asked them about was whether or not they want to use English in their work after they graduate. So the scale again was, I don't want to use English at all. Just basic greetings are enough. Talking to customers or clients, doing management in English, or want to work for a company using mostly English. And again, you can see that this is affected by how much time the students have already spent abroad. So those who've never been abroad or spent 1 to 3 months, actually, interestingly, most students tended to report that they would like to talk using English. But by the time you go up the scale of it, basic greetings and talking to customers are the 2 most common things for students who spent either no time or relatively little time abroad. But if you go up to more complicated or ongoing use of English, managerial tasks, or primarily English, those who never spent any time abroad, that drops off quite noticeably again. Again, the students who have spent 6 or more months abroad are the ones who tend to report wanting to use more English in their work in the future. So the second largest portion were ones who said they would like to talk to customers on a regular basis. Interesting, managerial tasks was a bit lower here. In fact, it was lower than the ones who spent 1 to 3 months abroad. But when you go to primarily English, you can see that there's a massive jump here. In fact, this is about twice the percentage of the other two groups put together. So people who had spent a lot of time before speaking in the country using English, they really want to use it primarily in their working roles. Bearing in mind, of course, from the previous screen, that those students also said that they would, quite a lot of them said they would like to immigrate. So that's perhaps not surprising in that regard.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just want to jump in here. So yeah, with the managerial tasks, this might be something that's cultural, perhaps. In Japanese culture, Japanese people don't necessarily like to take responsibility for something. They generally like to defer the responsibility. So this may have something to do with their wishes to do managerial tasks in general and in English as well. Okay, so let's move on. So basically, the implications of all this are that the more experience that students have had using English, within a particular community, the more positive their attitudes are. And the effect is very noticeable for those that have spent 6 or more months abroad, as everyone just saw. And interestingly, some students, and you did mention this, Aaron, some students may actually become alienated from their own culture if they've spent maybe too much time abroad. They maybe don't necessarily fit in as well, and they certainly do wish to spend.
It's important to point out here in particular that in Japan, being part of the group, playing along with the local culture is very important. They have a famous saying in Japanese, which is deru kugi utareru, which means the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. So students who are already different in some respect, it's not surprising if they don't want to stay and work and live in Japan, because they probably find it harder, even though they actually have proficiency in certain skills that other students don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I generally agree with that statement, just based on personal experience of Japanese people that I know that have spent, some time abroad, and then they come back, and it's often hard for them to fit in the way that they maybe have fit in beforehand. Okay, so let's maybe finish off here. I think that's about, oh my gosh, that's almost the full hour. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions. I'm not sure if I have to unmute the microphones, but does anybody have any questions?
You can type them into the chat as well if you like, or you're welcome to turn on your microphone or camera or.
Okay, I would like to ask a question about the people who spend a lot of time abroad, like in England, for instance. Doesn't matter whether they come from Japan or Poland, let's say Poland, and they come back and they do not speak English properly, or they they cannot acquire the higher level things like that. Have you thought about this aspect? And maybe it's like, somehow connected.
It probably depends a little bit on what they've been doing. So actually, sometimes we get students in class who you think have spent a lot of time abroad, but they haven't. They've gone to an international school in Japan. This is something else we asked them about. We haven't discussed it here. So it really depends, I think, on what they're doing when they're there. The other thing is, I used to teach students in New Zealand, and you get a lot of study abroad groups who had come over, and these were the ones who'd spend a shorter amount of time together in the country. They quite often just stuck with their friends. So it depends a little bit on what the reason for them going there is, what they're doing there, and how that influences what their attitude, I think, is as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question entirely.
Okay. I'm asking. Okay, I'm asking about. Hello, I'm asking about that because I've got students at university who sometimes travel and they come back, but they complain about the level of their language, and that they still have problems, and they ask me what to do about it. I actually don't know sometimes how to help them.
So,
they spend a lot of time, but the results are
mediocre.
Let's say, mediocre. Yeah,
that's perhaps what they're doing when they go there. So as I mentioned, I would have students and they would quite often stick with each other, other people from their own culture as one issue. That probably
I would tend to agree with that sentiment as well. I've had many students over the years, many Japanese students that go on study abroad trips. And I think the biggest problem is they're often in some sort of a residence or something where they're with other international students, and Japanese students in particular, they'll find their own little group and they tend to stick to that group. They do everything together. So they're not necessarily always engaging in the manner that we think they are. And the other thing too is sometimes schools will send entire groups of students as a group to a particular, a study abroad trip, for example, for a few months. And those students don't really have the opportunities to necessarily engage with those people. And for Japanese people in particular, I know Polish people aren't shy, but Japanese people are very shy. A lot of Asian students tend to be shy, and they have a hard time sort of integrating with the community that they'd like to integrate with.
Okay.
The other issue that I had in New Zealand is I used to work for a polytechnic, so a technical college. The local New Zealand students weren't that interested in interacting with the international students very much either. So one thing which did help was getting a work holiday visa. I'm not sure if that's possible for Polish people, but so the students would have to go and get a job somewhere. Now, again, quite often they would go and work in a Japanese restaurant or something, which didn't really help very much. But those who went out and did something where they were just surrounded by native or English speakers tended to do better, but it was almost always individual students who were doing that.
Okay, so this is some kind of psychological aspect of the problem here, which is very important.
As much as anything, I think. It's
And
about attitude and opportunity, I think. So.
Socializing interactions, this is very important. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Sorry for interrupting, but the time is up. Another session will start in a minute. So if you have questions, can you send the questions?
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes. And sorry, one more thing. Okay, Daniel. So if there are any questions from the participants, can they send the questions to you directly by email?
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a way we can? Oops. Maybe
the emails are here in the conference prospectus or something like that. So if anybody has any questions, or if you'd like a copy of the paper which I mentioned at the start, please send me an email and I can send that out to people as well.
You just open it.
Yeah, by all means. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting us. We really appreciate it, and we just want to say dziękujemy.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you very much, Aaron, and hope to see you in our next conferences. Bye.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be in person. I look forward to coming again. So
okay, we are looking forward to. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Dobranoc.
Oh, dobranoc. No, it is.
Dobranoc. U nas jest dobranoc.
So it's midnight. Sorry, not midnight. It's midday. It's noon.
Midday there. Tutaj jest 7 godzina. Będziemy mieli obiad.
Okay, bye.
Dziękuję bardzo. Do widzenia.